All right, so imagine this. A company drops, what, millions on this big, splashy sustainability campaign, right?
Hmm.
And then, bam, social media blows up, accusations of hypocrisy everywhere. Turns out their supply chain is, well, not so sustainable after all.
Yeah, it's that disconnect, right, between the image and the reality.
Exactly. And it feels like it's happening more and more these days, every corporation trying to wear that good guy badge. But how much of it is really legit?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And it's a question researchers have been wrestling with for decades, as we can see from the mountain of research we've got piled up here. We're talking all the way back to the 1970s when even the idea of companies getting involved in social issues was a point of contention.
It's wild to think about now, right? But back then, CSR was practically a revolutionary concept.
Totally.
I mean, you've got researchers like Davis back in '73 laying out the arguments for and against businesses venturing beyond just the whole profit-making
Oh,
thing.
right, right. Like, should they even bother?
Exactly.
Hmm.
It was a time when that whole idea of a social contract, businesses having responsibilities to society because, well, they benefit from society, that was just starting to gain some traction.
Fascinating. So how do we get from should businesses even bother to practically every company feeling like they need a whole CSR report?
Well, I think a lot of it can be traced back to Carroll's four-part model of CSR in '79.
Okay, yeah.
He broke it down into economic, legal, ethical, and discretionary responsibilities, really kind of providing this framework for the field.
And that discretionary part, that's key, right? Because what might have been considered above and beyond back then, today, it's almost like an expectation.
Exactly. Think about how much societal expectations have changed, right?
Mhm.
What was once seen as philanthropy is now like the bare minimum. Consumers, they're voting with their wallets, and companies, they're starting to get the message.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've tackled the should they, shouldn't they question. But then we get to the big one, the question every executive wants the answer to. What's the business case for all this do-gooding? That's where the research from the 1980s comes in.
Right, because everyone wanted to prove that CSR wasn't just, some ethical pipe dream, but rather something that could actually be good for business.
Yeah.
And that's where you get those early studies, trying to find that link between a company's social responsibility and its financial performance, like that landmark study by Cochrane and Wood in '84.
Oh, right. They found a pretty clear connection there, didn't they?
They did. They actually used this method called content analysis, really digging into media coverage, annual reports, all that, to create a sort of social responsibility score for all these different companies.
Interesting.
And then they compared those scores to financial data.
So not just a hunch, they had the data to back it up.
Exactly. Now, to be fair, those early studies, they relied pretty heavily on databases like Compustat, which,
Mhm.
don't get me wrong, were groundbreaking at the time. But
But they couldn't capture everything.
exactly, they couldn't capture every single nuance of a company's social impact.
Yeah.
But even still, it was a major turning point, showing that CSR, it could be measured, it could be analyzed, and it had the potential to affect a company's bottom line.
It wasn't just about profits, though, right? As we moved into the 1990s, it felt like there was this whole other dimension added to CSR, this focus on the human side of the equation.
Absolutely. We start seeing this shift from just shareholder value
Yeah.
to this broader idea of stakeholders.
Yeah.
Yeah, stakeholders, employees, customers, communities, even the environment started to come into the picture.
Right, like that study, Turbine and Greening in 97, if I'm remembering correctly.
Exactly. They found that a company's rep for social responsibility was a big deal for attracting and keeping employees,
Mm.
especially in those really competitive job markets.
Yeah, yeah, which makes sense. I mean, people want to work for companies that, they actually believe in. It's not just about the paycheck anymore, right? It's about, like, aligning yourself with a company's values.
Right. It's about feeling good about where you work. And that's where social identity theory comes in.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting lens to look at all of this through.
Oh, how so?
Well, the theory basically says that we get part of our identity from the groups we're part of,
Makes sense.
and that includes our workplaces.
Right.
So naturally, we're drawn to companies that kind of reflect our own values,
Mhm.
our own hopes for the world.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. So it's good for employees, good for the bottom line, but did all this research actually explore how CSR impacts the people who are supposed to be benefiting on the other end?
That's a great question. And it's one that really started to take center stage in the 2000s. You saw this surge in research trying to unpack those mechanisms.
The 2000s, that's when the whole triple bottom line thing started gaining traction, right? People, planet, profit.
Exactly. And with it, you saw a way bigger emphasis on environmental sustainability. But I think what's really interesting about the research from this period is how it went beyond just measuring, like how much CSR companies were doing, and started digging into the why. Like, what's the motivation behind it all?
Okay, so what were researchers finding? What were some of the motivations they uncovered?
Well, take Banzel and Roth's 2000 study. Instead of just looking at a company's environmental practices, they actually sat down with the executives, interviewed them to try to understand what drove their decisions.
Interesting.
And what they found was that individual leaders, their values, their experiences, even their social networks, played a huge role in shaping a company's commitment to sustainability.
So it's not just some calculated business decision. There's actual passion fueling some of these changes.
Sometimes, yeah. And you really see this reflected in how many different theories researchers were applying to CSR. Institutional theory, for example, that helped explain how a company's social and cultural context, its environment, really influences its approach to responsibility.
Right.
And then you have strategic management, which gave us this whole other perspective by looking at how companies could leverage CSR for a competitive edge.
So many different lenses. It's really interesting to see a field like this evolves, pulling in all these different disciplines to try to get a more complete picture.
It really is. It's like putting together this giant complex puzzle.
And speaking of different perspectives, I'm remembering that study, Matten and Moon in 2008, that compared CSR in the US versus Europe.
Oh, yeah. Classic study.
What a contrast, right? Almost like comparing apples and oranges.
Totally. Like they found that in the U.S., CSR was often very explicit. Companies were very eager to broadcast their good deeds.
Yeah.
But in Europe, it was much more like woven into the fabric of how they did business, a little more implicit.
Interesting. Different cultural contexts, for sure, but both striving toward that same goal of corporate responsibility.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got the why, we've got the how, but what about the so what? With all this research, with all these different approaches, are we any closer to really understanding the actual impact of CSR? Or is it all just a feel-good exercise?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the answer, like with most things in research, is complicated. I mean, the early studies, while definitely groundbreaking, they did have their limitations.
Right, like those methodological issues you hear about sometimes, where maybe things weren't always as airtight as they could have been.
Exactly. Some studies maybe jump to conclusions without really considering all the other factors that could be at play, or they relied on data that, just couldn't capture all those nuances of social impact. But that's research for you. It's all about constantly refining, reevaluating.
So how did things evolve from there? What were some of those advancements in methodology and data analysis that helped address some of those early limitations? Well, for one thing, researchers started using way more sophisticated statistical techniques, working with larger sample sizes, doing these longitudinal studies that track impact over a much longer period.
Okay, so really digging into the long game, not
Right.
just a snapshot in time,
Exactly. And there's been a lot more emphasis on qualitative research, too.
which is all about.
Going beyond just the numbers, trying to understand the how and the why behind the data.
Right, like those lived experience interviews you see popping up more and more, getting that human perspective alongside all the hard data.
Exactly. Because, at the end of the day, we want to know, are these CSR initiatives actually making a difference in the lives of the people they're trying to help? And answer that, you have to be willing to cross those disciplinary boundaries.
Okay, so not just business researchers studying businesses. We need sociologists, environmental scientists, maybe even anthropologists to really get a full picture.
Exactly. This whole transdisciplinary approach, it's crucial if you really want to capture the impact of CSR, which, let's face it, is multifaceted.
Yeah.
Like imagine partnering with community organizations, for example.
Okay, yeah.
Suddenly researchers, they've got this direct line to understanding how a company's actions are actually being perceived, being experienced at the grassroots level.
It's a whole different level of insight, and it really speaks to how far this whole field has come. I mean, we've gone from those early debates about whether businesses should even be involved in social issues to, well, it feels like CSR is everywhere you turn these days, especially with the rise of ESG investing.
It's true. ESG has become a major force, no doubt. Investors are really scrutinizing a company's social and environmental track record alongside, the financial stuff.
But how can we be sure it's not just greenwashing? Like a clever marketing ploy to appease investors and consumers without any real substance behind it.
That is the million-dollar question, and it's where research becomes even more important.
Mm.
We need that rigorous analysis to separate those genuine efforts from the more superficial stuff.
It can't just be about talking the talk. Companies have to walk the walk.
Exactly. And research can hold their feet to the fire.
It's interesting, though, because it's not just about the companies themselves anymore, right? Like, it feels like even within organizations, you've got this whole movement of employees pushing for change from within.
Absolutely. And researchers are definitely paying attention to those internal dynamics. Like, there was this fascinating study by Wickert and DeBaker in 2018.
Mm.
They were looking at how managers try to get buy-in for CSR initiatives within their companies.
Interesting.
And what they found was that it's not always this top-down thing. A lot of times, it takes individuals within these companies, championing these causes, navigating all that complex office politics to really make things happen.
It's like this whole hidden world of activism that we don't always see. It really speaks to how complex this whole thing is, this whole world of CSR. It's this intricate web of motivations and actions and impacts, and honestly, I feel like we've just scratched the surface here today. But if we're trying to wrap up our deep dive into decades of research, what would you say are some of the key takeaways you really want our listeners to walk away with?
I think one of the biggest things that stands out to me is just how much CSR has evolved.
Yeah.
It's gone from this kind of peripheral concern to this core consideration for businesses.
Right, like it's not just a side project anymore.
Exactly. And we've seen how it can impact a company's bottom line, its ability to attract talent, its reputation.
It's good business, but it's more than that too, right?
100%. It's about recognizing that businesses, they have this responsibility to address these big social and environmental issues, not just because it might make them more money, but because it's the right thing to do. And research, it's going to be crucial moving forward because it has the power to hold businesses accountable. It can help make sure they're actually creating a more just and sustainable world.
A more just and sustainable world. I like the sound of that. That's a great note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from those early debates about the role of business in society, all the way to the rise of ESG investing. And as always, you can find links to all the research we talked about in the show notes. But for now, we'll leave you with this. What questions would you want answered? What would you want to explore if you were designing a CSR study today? Think about it, and who knows, maybe it'll spark your next big idea. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and stay curious.